Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are. My name is Teacher Alastair, and welcome to our free trial class for Wright Homeschool Academy's The Big Names of History course. The purpose of today's session is to introduce you to the course material and give you a sense for a typical class in it. On that note, if you're not planning on purchasing our asynchronous learning package and are rather interested in signing up for our live interactive classes, a quick disclaimer that today's session might have a slightly different vibe to it than a normal class you'd have with us, and that's just because there are no other students here right now. It's just me. So that means the points in class at which I ask questions would normally be responded to by students raising their hands, answering the questions, maybe discussing. What you'll see in today's recording instead is I'll put up a 3-second timer with my fingers like this. And that should give you enough time to hit the pause button and answer the question yourself. However you see fit. You can turn and discuss with a friend, you can write it down, say it aloud, mull it over in your head, whatever works best for you. Also, the live interactive classes are exactly 1 hour long, and the recording you're watching right now is a little shorter than that. That's again because there's no student interaction, and also because there's no bamboozle at the end. What is bamboozle, you might be wondering? Well, it's a fun, interactive question and answer review game that we've specially designed to review the material that we cover in each class. So you'll get a look at the bamboozle for this class at the end of today's recording, and the link to play the game will be in the description box below. One final housekeeping issue is that it might not be me, Teacher Alastair, actually teaching you the course, and that's because we have several educators on our team here at Wright Homeschool Academy. So if you're interested in learning more about our educator requirements or want to take a look at our educator profiles, they're all on our website, the link for which is also in the description box below. So with all that being said, let's get started with the course, The Big Names of History. As the name implies, it is a history course, but we've decided to take a slightly different tack with this one. Instead of choosing an event or a time period and studying that, we've decided to choose one person, a big name from a historical period, and study their lives in depth. And in this way, we can see their time and their place through their eyes and learn about that time period and place in that way, while also learning about the accomplishments of the great people throughout history. Which explains the tagline for the course: we're studying the people from the past who have shaped our present world. Perhaps you recognize some of them from the cartoon you can see as the background here. Many of them are covered in the course. The course itself is divided up into 3 sections, each of which has 25 classes. We'll take a look at them now, so if at any point you want to pause and take a closer look at all the names, please do feel free. I'll also point out that certainly in section 1, there's a bit of a pattern that's followed here. So the first week will be an artistic cultural figure. So in today's recording, the trial class will be covering Vincent van Gogh. The second week is more of a science and innovation type character, so Marie Curie. And then the third and final in the cycle is a military/political figure. So that would be George Washington. And then you can see the cycle repeats. Okay, so that's the first section. Moving on here to section 2. Quick note about section 2, in classes 9 and 10, there is actually more than one big name of history. So class 9 is Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, 3 of the greatest Greek philosophers. And class 10 has Sacagawea and Pocahontas. Other than those 2, though, each class covers one historical figure. And finally, here's section 3. So tell us, which of these big names of history are you most excited to learn about? Awesome. Well, we are looking forward to studying them with you as well. Let's go ahead and jump into today's material. You heard me mention earlier that we're covering Vincent van Gogh. Have you heard of him before? What do you already know about him? Awesome. Well, hopefully there's a lot more that you'll learn about him in today's class. Let's start with what he looked like. Thankfully, unlike some of our other historical figures, we know quite a bit about what Vincent van Gogh looked like, and that's because he painted himself. These are self-portraits that Vincent van Gogh did of himself, and he did many of them throughout his life. Why did he do so many? You might be wondering. Well, the simple answer is because if you want to paint what you see in the mirror, it's free. But if you want a model to sit on a stool while you paint them, you have to pay them. So if you're a struggling, starving artist like Vincent van Gogh, painting yourself is a really cost-effective way of honing your skills, sharpening your talents. So let's start with some basic facts about Vincent van Gogh. You're looking at yet another self-portrait he did of himself in 1888. He was born in 1853. He held many jobs throughout his life, but he's most famously remembered as an artist, in particular, a painter, as I'm sure you've figured out by now. He was born in the Netherlands. He had 2 brothers and 3 sisters, and he died in 1890. So for those of you math whizzes out there, he was 37 years old when he died, very young, unless his birthday hadn't come up yet, in which case he'd be 36. Still, a life cut tragically short, and his death is something we'll cover towards the end of class. Okay, what you're looking at here is another of Vincent van Gogh's works. It's what we would call a landscape because it depicts the natural world, a landscape. And it looks to be about evening time, sundown, twilight, as it's sometimes called. And therefore, this painting is called Landscape at Twilight, painted in 1890. Not the most creative of names. And I think you'll find as we study some more paintings in today's class, that's a pretty common theme, actually. The names of the paintings typically aren't very creative. I like to say the creativity comes out in the painting itself, not really the name. All right, I'll also point out that normally students would be taking turns doing the reading, and we would discuss any difficult vocabulary that comes up along the way. However, again, since there are no other students here right now, I'll be doing the readings. So Vincent van Gogh, one of the most, and by the way, his name would have been pronounced Van Gogh in his own language, but for us English speakers out there who don't want to hack up a lung every time we're saying his name, it's perfectly acceptable to pronounce it Vincent van Gogh. So he was one of the most celebrated painters in history, born on March 30th, 1853, in the small village of Groot Zundert in the Netherlands. His life, though tragically short, was a whirlwind of passion, struggle, and unrelenting creativity. Van Gogh's journey from a humble preacher's son to an artistic visionary is a story of resilience, a testament to the power of art, and a poignant reminder of the fragility of the human mind. I'll point out that Vincent van Gogh is sort of the prototypical misunderstood artist. His life was marked by poverty and struggle and emotional troubles and distress. And so he's sort of the picture-perfect tortured artist, the kind of artistic figure who makes beautiful and deep, profound art. And yet in their personal lives, they suffer tragedy and loss, and nobody really understands them until after they've already left this world. Continuing on, Willem van Gogh was the eldest of 6 surviving children born to Theodorus van Gogh, a Protestant minister, which is sort of like a preacher. His job is to preach the word of the Christian God. And Anna Cornelia Carbentus. His family was deeply religious, specifically Christian, and his early years were marked by a strict upbringing. The Van Gogh family was also steeped in the art world. Vincent's uncle, also named Vincent, not to get confused here, he was referred to as Uncle Cent, was an art dealer. This connection would later play a crucial role in Vincent's career. And the reason that it would, just to be a little bit more specific, is because Vincent's older brother, Theo, took over Uncle Cent's art studio and became an art dealer himself. So it was a little bit more indirect. Van Gogh was a quiet and introspective child. Introspective meaning looking inward, thinking, taking comfort and solace and solitude, okay with being alone, thoughtful. Often described as serious and reflective. He showed an early interest in art, spending much of his time sketching the rural landscape of his surroundings. Despite his apparent talent, his formal education was erratic, meaning chaotic, irregular, as Vincent was prone to mood swings and bouts of depression, which would haunt him throughout his life. So here's more contributing to the theme of the tortured artist. Okay, let's take a look at another landscape painted by Vincent van Gogh. You may begin to notice a pattern here. Perhaps you're picking up on his style. This landscape depicts some sheaves of wheat, and the moon looks to be rising. And therefore, the painting is titled, drumroll please, that's right, Landscape with Wheat Sheaves and Rising Moon, painted in 1889, another creative name. It wasn't until 1880, at the age of 27, that Van Gogh decided to pursue a career as an artist. His brother Theo, who had become an art dealer, as I mentioned before, supported him both financially and emotionally, providing Vincent with the means to study and create. One of his most famous early works, The Potato Eaters in 1885, exemplifies this early phase of raw, almost brutal honesty in his work. We'll take a look at The Potato Eaters in a moment. In 1886, Van Gogh moved to Paris to live with Theo. This move proved to be a turning point in his career. Paris was the epicenter of the art world at that time, and Vincent was introduced to the burgeoning movements of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. We'll talk about those as well. He met and befriended several influential artists, including Paul Gauguin, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and Camille Pissarro. The vibrant colors and innovative techniques of the Impressionists had a profound impact on Van Gogh's work. He began experimenting with brighter palettes, bolder brushstrokes, and new compositional techniques. His subjects also shifted, reflecting the urban landscape of Paris, including cafes, parks, and the Seine River. Works like the Café Terrace at Night, here, and the Seine, that's the name of the river, with the Pont de la Grande Jette, pont is French for bridge, so here it is, from this period show his evolving style. So you'll see, guys, that Vincent van Gogh's earliest works are very dark and moody. There's a lot of black and gray, and the subject, that is what he is painting, is often very raw and real and can be often ugly and dirty. Then later, as he moves to Paris, which, as I mentioned, is the epicenter of the art world at the time, this is where people went if they wanted to rub elbows with the biggest names in the industry at that time. Van Gogh, his style took on a new twist, and now he was painting the things that were around him. He started using different styles, brighter colors, etc. Okay, that's going to take us to our first video clip. We typically have one at about the halfway point, and then one more towards the end of class just before we play our bamboozle. I'll turn on the subtitles and I'll turn off my video and microphone so there's no background noise. Here we go.
You probably know me already. I'm famous the world over. But do you know my story? Brabant, painted just as I remember it. That's where I grew up. I was different from the others. Stubborn, always in trouble at home and at school. Things were better outdoors. I loved being out in the fields. Do you know what you want to be yet? Well, I certainly didn't. I was an art dealer in Paris and London, a teacher in England, a priest in Belgium. I tried the lot. Nothing worked out. My brother, Theo, my best friend, had an idea. Vincent, you're good at drawing. Why don't you do something with that? Well, he was right. I was always drawing, and I could learn how to paint. There was no time to lose. Practice, practice, practice. I was unstoppable. Anton Mauve, my cousin and a famous artist, taught me how to paint in oils. I got my first commission, drawing cityscapes of The Hague, the train station. What a building, all that glass. I wanted to show real life, nature, the lives of farmers, what I saw as I felt it. That's what I wanted to paint, something good, something with soul in it. And look, there they are, their weather-beaten faces in the shadows, sitting in the light of a small lamp, poking their calloused hands into the dish of potatoes they themselves have sown and harvested. Others didn't think much of it. That woman's nose looks like dice at the end of a pipe stem. Even Theo thought it was too dark. But I had started. I was an artist. Theo, I owe you so much. When I came to Paris, I lived with you. When I wanted to paint, you paid for my paints and brushes. And me, I was insufferable, living only for my art. Late-night discussions with innovative artists like Lautrec, Bernard, Gogh, about contrasts, colours, loose brushstrokes. But the work wasn't selling. I rarely had money for models, so I'd often end up looking in the mirror. After 2 years, I was fed up with the city. I headed south, to the light, the colours. That's where I painted the colours of the wheat, of the night, and the sea, which had many more colours than just blue. Green, purple, blue, pink. The sea changes colour like a mackerel's skin. I looked around me and found beauty in almost everything, even in these withering sunflowers. I had big plans for this yellow house. It's where I wanted to work with others, to create a new kind of art. But only my artist friend Gogh came south. We had the most fierce discussions about art. What should you paint? What you see with your eyes, or what you see in your mind? One evening, things started to go wrong. I just wasn't myself anymore. I cut off my left ear. I was sick. I had myself admitted to hospital. But I didn't stop. I worked on, like some kind of painting locomotive. And slowly I got my life back on track. In the countryside, just north of Paris, with Theo close by, I worked incessantly. My head was on fire. My paintbrush swept back and forth until... Now you know my story. The story of a misunderstood, stubborn man who wouldn't give up. A story about needing to do what it is that you're good at. So tell me, what are you good at?
So there it is. There's the whole story of Van Gogh, and we'll be going over some of those details together now. So Van Gogh, as we've learned, was a Dutch artist. Dutch just means you come from the Netherlands, sometimes called Holland in northwestern Europe. He painted portraits. That's when the subject is a single person, sometimes a group of people, and also landscapes, which, as we've seen, is where the subject is the outdoors. He used both watercolors and oil paints, although I will say oil paints were his preference, definitely. He painted something like 950 paintings that we still have today. And of those, I think 860 were oil paints, if memory serves. So the overwhelming majority were done with oil. That was his favorite medium or thing to use to paint with. And it seems as though he really only used watercolors when he didn't have any more oil paints left to use. He's famous for using bright colors and bold brushstrokes in his work. What we mean when we say bold brushstrokes is when you compare Vincent van Gogh's work to some of the other of his contemporaries, that is, people who were active and painting at the same time as him. If we're talking about the Impressionists or those who came before, they often were more interested in having very small, precise, teeny tiny little brushstrokes where they tried to encapsulate very sharp details. Whereas Vincent van Gogh was less interested in that kind of thing, and he would just make bigger, bolder, brushstrokes that might appear sloppy to people who are interested in recreating a photorealistic version of what you can see with your eyes. But for Van Gogh and the other post-impressionists, as we'll discuss in a moment, it was less about taking a photograph and more about making a point with the art. All right, so we'll talk a bit about this style, post-impressionism, right now. So what is post-impressionist painting? What is post-impressionism? Well, it's an art movement that came after Impressionism. That's what post means. Post means after. So post-impressionism literally means coming after a different art movement named Impressionism. And this took place during the late 19th century, so the time period in which Vincent van Gogh was active, from around 1886 to 1905. While Impressionists focused on capturing fleeting moments and the effects of light, post-Impressionists took things a step further. Post-Impressionist artists like Vincent van Gogh, Paul Cézanne, and Georges Seurat used bold colors, distinct brushstrokes, and unique ways of depicting reality, sort of in the way that I just described. They were interested in expressing emotions and ideas through their art rather than just recreating the external appearance of things. So the art is speaking to you. It is giving you a message. Something from the artist's mind is being communicated through the art rather than just what the artist can actually see. Therefore, post-impressionism can be thought of as a colorful and expressive twist on impressionism. Colorful is a good word there because unlike the Impressionists, the post-Impressionists didn't always use the same colors that they saw with their eyes. They might change the color of something, again, in order to make a deeper, more profound point. Artists in this movement played with shapes, colors, and techniques to show more than what meets the eye, giving their paintings a deeper and more personal touch. Okay? So taking a look here on the left, you can see an Impressionist painting, and on the right, one of the most famous, if not the most famous, post-Impressionist painting. So there's a little bit more here about the differences between the two art styles. If you're interested in reading more about that, I recommend pausing the video now and reading about them. But I think what we've said already should suffice for our discussion today. And for now, I'd like to show you some artworks. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you these pictures, the ones you see listed here at the bottom. So starting with Impressionism, we've got Soleil Levant, which means the rising sun by Claude Monet. This next one is Woman with a Parasol. It's like a sun umbrella, also by Monet. Next up, we've got Luncheon of the Boating Party by Renoir, Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Here is Paris Street. Oh, no, I'm sorry. This is A Bar at the Folies Bergère by Edouard Manet. So yes, in the Impressionist style camp, there's both a Monet and a Manet. Different. All right, and this next one is Paris Street, Rainy Day, because as the name implies, the subject is a street in Paris on a rainy day. So these are the Impressionist style paintings. You can see that they're all doing something with the light, the effects of light, these fleeting moments, these candid snapshots, and they are very realistic for the most part. All right, let's look at some post-impressionist paintings, starting with, again, the most popular one, The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. Here we have The Card Players by Paul Cézanne. Down here in the bottom left, I put it La Toilette by Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. Over here on the bottom right, we've got Lady in Blue by Paul Cézanne. And then last but not least, down here center middle is A Sunday Afternoon on the island of La Grangette. Remember that one? Van Gogh painted the bridge going over it by Georges Seurat. So guys, do you think you could distinguish between Impressionist and post-Impressionist artworks? And maybe a simpler question, which one of these paintings is your favorite? Do you have one? Why is it your favorite? Okay. For me personally, I would say it's Soleil Levant by Monet. I don't know, something about it evokes some kind of emotion. I can't even put words to it. Some kind of whimsical emotions. It just looks like something you would sit and watch peacefully. You can almost feel the sea breeze on your skin, smell the salty air. Just does it for me. How about you? Okay, guys, another question for you. Can you remember an artist who painted using the post-impressionism style? Maybe you said Vincent van Gogh. That counts. That counts. There's, Georges Seurat, there's Lautrec, others as well. Cézanne. And here's another question for you. What two words do you think best describe post-impressionism? I wonder what words you came up with. Maybe bold, vibrant, colorful, emotional, personal, conceptual. It's about a concept rather than photorealistic recreation of reality. Lots of different words we could use to describe post-impressionism. All right, let's timeline out Van Gogh's painting career. You've heard it in narrative form. Some of us are visual learners, and it's easier for us to chronologically order things in our mind if it's laid out on a timeline. So let's start in 1880. Remember, at this stage, Van Gogh is already 27 years old, right? So that's a late start. Van Gogh's brother, that's Theo, suggested that he become an artist. At this stage, he had already tried many other different jobs, including following in his father's footsteps as a preacher, which didn't work out for him. And I'll point out is a common theme in a lot of our big names of history classes, where there are a lot of these figures whose fathers were involved in the Christian church and whose fathers wanted them to follow in their footsteps, and they didn't. They went their own path, and they became world famous. He went to an art school in Brussels. Brussels is in Belgium, so not far from the Netherlands, and started to learn about drawing. In 1882, he visited his relative, a cousin of his named Anton Mauve, who introduced him to painting with oil paint. And as you know, there was no going back for Van Gogh after that. He fell in love with oil paint. The sad thing is that oil paint is the most expensive of all the paints, and Van Gogh did not always have the money to buy it. He produced his first significant painting called The Potato Eaters, which I promised we'll look at, and I still promise we will, in 1885. 1886, he moved to Paris. This is where he discovered the work of some artists called the French Impressionists. Okay, in 1888, Van Gogh had had enough of the bustling city life and wanted to get out of Paris and into the countryside. So he moved south to Arles in Provence, southern France. This was his most productive and happy period, during which he lived with fellow painter Paul Gauguin. You'll also notice he used yellow a lot, like in this painting. The following year, he voluntarily admitted himself to an asylum, like a mental hospital, essentially, in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, which is sort of in between Arles and Paris. And it's there that he painted some of his most iconic works, including The Starry Night, which we've already seen, Irises, and then Wheat Field with Cypresses, pictured here. In 1890, Van Gogh moved to Auvers-sur-Oise, a small village near Paris, to be under the care of Dr. Paul Gachet, a physician and also art enthusiast. Seems like a good fit for Van Gogh. A doctor to take care of him who also appreciates his art. Before Van Gogh's death in this year, he painted over 70 works in just 70 days. That's, doing the math, carry one, that's almost one work a day, right? And these included many of his pieces that would later be recognized as masterpieces. And I'll emphasize here, later recognized. That's because during his own time, Van Gogh was not appreciated or understood. Remember, I told you that he was the quintessential misunderstood, tortured, starving artist. Okay, 1891, of course, this is the year after his death, but this is when his sister-in-law, so that's his brother Theo's wife, her name was Jo Van Gogh Bonger, she hyphenated her last name, began organizing exhibitions of Vincent's work in the Netherlands. Her efforts ultimately led to the recognition and widespread appreciation of Vincent's artwork. Basically, what had happened is Theo had died, and Vincent died shortly thereafter, leaving Jo in kind of a tricky situation. She needed a way to make money, and so she's a clever lady, and she got to work marketing and promoting the artworks of Vincent van Gogh. And ultimately, it worked. His artworks became famous around the world. Okay, here's a gallery of some of Van Gogh's most famous works. On the far left, there is The Potato Eaters. Note the dark, moody coloring and the raw, dirty, real subject matter, which is characteristic of Van Gogh's earliest stage. The middle stage, we have Sunflowers, painted in 1888. This was in Arles in southern France, where he was happy and productive. Note all the yellow. And then finally, Starry Night, 1889. So by this stage, he's admitted himself to the mental hospital and is still pressing forward, driven to produce these works of art. And these are maybe a healthy mix between the two. They're sort of dark and moody, but they have bright points. And they are not melancholy, I wouldn't say. Okay, here are a few other of his paintings. Here's the bedroom that he stayed at in Arles. So again, painted in 1888. How would you describe this painting? Right, we're all becoming art aficionados here. Listen to you. All right, this next one, Olive Trees in 1889 and the following, Irises of the same year, both of which were painted during his stay in the mental asylum. Which one of these is your favorite? Why? For me, I think it's irises. I just think they're a beautiful flower. Maybe I'm a simple guy. Okay, let's talk a bit more about the potato eaters. The painting shows 5 people sitting around a table eating potatoes. Van Gogh had not been painting for very long when he made this picture. He painted it with, of course, his favorite oil paints, and he wanted to show real life in his painting. He used very dark colors in this artwork. And this is considered this is considered the first major painting produced by Van Gogh, The Potato Eaters. So what are your thoughts on it? Can you describe this painting? Well, that's a good description you've offered there. I would just point out that one thing that makes this painting stand out from the others is that it was very different from the other paintings being produced by big artists at the time. Most of the big artists at the time, as you saw in some of the paintings I showed you earlier, were painting landscapes, cityscapes, portraits of beautifully clad people. For the most part, painting the common folk, the lower classes, the peasants, whatever you want to call them, or they were called at their own time, was not a popular thing to do. In fact, this is part of the reason why Van Gogh's paintings did not sell. He was not painting things that were trendy or popular at that time, but rather painting the things that he wanted to showcase. Okay, here's Sunflowers from 1888. He painted this for his friend, the artist Paul Gauguin. So Van Gogh moved from Paris to Arles, and his dream was to begin an artist commune, basically a place where artists from all over could come and live and share the expenses of living together and focus all of their energy and time towards producing artwork. However, only Paul Gauguin answered the call and actually went south and stayed with Vincent in the house. And while Vincent was waiting for Paul Gauguin to arrive, he painted this, among several other paintings of sunflowers, to give to Paul Gauguin as a gift, like a welcome to this house in Arles type gift. He chose the color yellow to represent happiness. He made lots of paintings of sunflowers, and this is probably one of Van Gogh's most popular and famous paintings. Have you seen it before? What do you think of it? All right, and this one I can almost guarantee you've seen before. It is not only one of Van Gogh's most famous paintings, it's one of the most famous paintings in the whole world. And the reason Van Gogh painted it is he was very interested in the nighttime and what he could do with oil paint, his favorite, to make these swirling effects that you see here. And he wanted to make the moon and stars appear as though they were glowing. So that's what he was using the yellow paint for. Another fun fact about the Starry Night is that actually Van Gogh wasn't fond of it. When he finished it, he thought that he had failed in his vision for it. And it was one of his least favorite paintings that he had done. He described it as, quote unquote, a failure. I guess the rest of the world just disagrees. You know what they say, you're your own biggest critic. All right, let's hear a little bit more about Van Gogh's breakdown. So Van Gogh had been struggling with mental health issues for much of his life. He lived an unhealthy lifestyle, and most of his diet consisted of alcohol, tobacco, and bread, which is pretty much all he could afford. He experienced many romantic rejections and was called the crazy red fox by his neighbors. So you can only imagine the kind of shenanigans he was getting up to earn the nickname the crazy red fox. Van Gogh's eccentric personality caused his relationship with fellow artist Paul Gauguin to become strained during their time living and working together in Arles, France. One night, after a heated argument with Gauguin, Van Gogh cut off part of his own ear with a razor. The exact reason he did this is a little unclear, and he later claimed to have no memory of the incident. So certainly we can say alcohol was involved. Some people have speculated that maybe there was some kind of romantic relationship between the two of them, although there's no solid evidence for that. Ultimately, we may never know why Van Gogh did this. In his own words, he doesn't know why he did it. But one thing is certain, and that's that this incident indicates that Van Gogh was a deeply troubled and unhealthy person who needed help, and that's why he admitted himself to the mental hospital. The incident marks one of the most well-known and tragic episodes in Van Gogh's life, highlighting the challenges he faced in coping with his mental health issues and the struggles he encountered in his personal relationships. Despite his hardships, Van Gogh continued to create art pieces, and his work has since become some of the most highly regarded and influential in the history of Western art. Though Van Gogh was considered a failure and a madman by his contemporaries, he's considered today as a genius and the perfect picture of the tormented artist. Okay, guys, that's going to take us to our second and final video clip. Here we go.
Few men evoke the image of a tortured and misunderstood artist quite as well as Vincent van Gogh. His tale is a particularly tragic one. He died miserable and broke, only for his unsold paintings to become masterpieces mere decades after his death. In fact, Vincent's career was such a failure that we know of only one painting that he managed to sell during his lifetime. It's this one, the Red Vineyard. So why exactly was Vincent such a stunning disappointment? Well, for a start, he was what we'd call a late bloomer. He started painting seriously pretty late in his life, entering the Belgian Royal Academy at age 27. Now, this was during the height of Impressionism, a counter-movement that rejected traditional painting techniques in favor of short, broken brushstrokes that emphasized light and movement. Reminds me of my old hairstyle. So much light and movement, shimmying and shaking. Vincent, for all his acclaim, was never a particularly skilled painter. He couldn't draw in a photorealistic manner, and so he dropped out of the academy to pursue Impressionism. The hottest place to be for an Impressionist at the time was Paris. That's where the movement had begun, and it was also where its wealthiest patrons resided. Vincent, however, didn't arrive in Paris until 1886, at the very tail end of the movement. He was a latecomer to an already crowded trade, one of probably hundreds of wannabe Impressionists. Many of the original Impressionists were already famous by the time they rebelled against the establishment. Monet, the founder of Impressionism, for example, earned his credentials with near photorealistic paintings, such as this one. Amazing. Vincent, unfortunately, had no such foundation to build upon. He also didn't have any social connections. When he arrived in Paris, his only friend in the art world was his own brother, Theo. Theo had been working as an art dealer in Paris since 1884, and unlike his older brother, he was actually pretty successful in his career. It is through Theo that Vincent was acquainted with other contemporary Impressionists, though unfortunately Theo's connections didn't extend into the world of deep-pocketed patrons. Theo would end up being Vincent's main source of financing. Yet, despite Theo's line of work, the majority of Vincent's paintings would eventually be bartered away to secure painting materials or food. Complicating Vincent's financial situation was his copious consumption of alcohol and tobacco. In his latter years, he'd resort to a diet of bread and water just so he could afford his other vices. Unsurprisingly, his health deteriorated quite rapidly, as did his mental state, and in early 1889 he was admitted into a mental asylum. Interestingly enough, during his stay, Vincent produced over 100 paintings, including some of his most famous ones, with his style evolving into what is now called post-impressionism. He left the mental asylum in May 1890, and 2 months later decided to shoot himself in the gut, as you do. Understandably, Theo was devastated and couldn't come to terms with Vincent's death for the rest of his life, which amounted to 6 months, since he caught syphilis shortly after. Oh, Theo, what have you been doing? The task of preserving Vincent's legacy fell onto Theo's widow. She donated his paintings to any museum that would take them and published the letters Theo and Vincent had written to each other. Her timing proved to be perfect. She published the letters in 1914, right around the time when American art dealers were entering the European art market. As the era of Impressionism came to a close, numerous American institutions purchased lesser-known Parisian art at bargain prices. The Detroit Institute of Arts was the first to acquire one of Vincent's paintings, and before long, Americans were writing biographies, dedicating solo exhibitions, and making movies about him. It really was a compelling story. A lonely artist pouring his soul onto the canvas, and it made a ton of money for the art dealers who bought his paintings on the cheap. Well, my friends, I hope I haven't discouraged you from pursuing a career in fine arts. It's a tough business, but the rewards for your children and grandchildren could be spectacular.
All right. Normally, we'd go straight to Bamboozle here, but I do have some other fun facts to share with you before we go. So here in his early years, Van Gogh painted mostly still life and a project he called Peasant Character Studies, in which he used the local working poor as his models. He wanted to set up an artist commune in Arles where artists could live simply and immerse themselves in their craft. Okay, also, Van Gogh made a portrait of the doctor Felix Ray, who had taken care of him after his severed ear incident. There's the portrait there. Dr. Ray, though, didn't like the painting. He used it to fix his broken chicken coop, like he was propping up something with it. After Van Gogh's death, it was added to a museum collection and is currently valued at about 50 million US dollars. Can you imagine, guys? This was used to prop up his chicken coop, and now it's worth $50 million. All right, that painting you're looking at right there is called The Red Vineyard, and it's the only painting that we know of for sure that Van Gogh sold for money rather than trading it for more paint or food just to survive. It sold for 400 francs, which is worth about 2,000 US dollars today, so pretty good. It was purchased by 2 members of Les 20, which means the 20, a group of 20 Belgian artists who for 10 years had an annual exhibition of their work and invited 20 other artists to do the same. So other artists bought his work, possibly as an act of charity. Okay, Van Gogh produced more than 2,000 works of art, including around 900 paintings and 1,100 drawings and sketches. Most of these were done in his final 2 years of life. Almost all of his paintings were oil paintings, 860 of them. He bartered many of his paintings for food and services since he had no money and his paintings weren't selling at his brother's art gallery. Okay. Several of Van Gogh's paintings are among the most expensive ever sold. So the portrait of Dr. Gachet, the portrait of Joseph Roulin, and irises that we saw earlier, you'll note here that they were all #1, the most expensive paintings ever to be sold at the time that they were sold. Okay, so they sold for hundreds of millions of dollars, US dollars. Okay, so that's it, guys. Now we move over to Bamboozle. Normally, all the students would take time to play it. I'll just give you a sneak peek. These are the types of questions I would expect you to be able to answer following the class. So which two types of painting is Van Gogh famous for painting? Where was he born? In what century? Name two artists who painted using the post-impressionist style. What is post-impressionism? Where did Van Gogh go to art school? Who encouraged him to go? What struggles did Van Gogh have during his lifetime? Name three. What is this painting called, and why did Van Gogh use yellow? What was his first significant painting called? What do you think of it? What is this painting called? And tell us a fun fact about Van Gogh. So we hope that you'll head down into the description box below, find the link for the Bamboozle, the website, including where to sign up for the class long term. And we hope that you enjoyed yourself and learned lots. That's all the time we have for today. So from all of us here at Wright Homeschool Academy, see you in class.